Western leaders should have educated their people and say, hey, the world is changing. We have to adjust and adapt. We cannot just be on autopilot and do whatever we've been doing in the past. But there's been no Western leader who's prepared to acknowledge just the basic fact that the 21st century will be the Asian century. So if it's going to be the Asian century, then all the efforts by the West to try and maintain its domination is unwise. And Southeast Asia was supposed to be the Balkans of Asia. And lots of Westerners predicted, decades of warfare in Southeast Asia. But, the answer is complex, which is why I co-authored an entire book, ASEAN Miracle, to explain. One of the few books that tries to explain the deeper sources of peace in ASEAN. And one of the reasons for it is that Indonesia has exported its culture of musyawara and mufakat, mean consultation and consensus. So that habits of consultation and consensus is very critical for ASEAN's success.
Kishore, I'd like to first say thank you for coming on. I've read your book. I read this book from cover to cover as a young Singaporean, and one of the big things that I've taken away from it is that we do live in an Asian century, and we need to think for ourselves. And I've read some of your previous books as well, and there's a common thread throughout it, which is that as we step into the Asian century, we need to think as Asians, and we need to do the work of decolonizing ourselves intellectually. And you talk about it at length. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you on a personal note, what does it mean to decolonize yourself intellectually, and what was your personal journey like doing that?
Well, I think the disadvantage that young Singaporeans like you have is that your minds will never colonize. Whereas the advantage we had in my generation is that our minds were colonized. And certainly when I was born in Singapore in 1948, my birth certificate said I was a British subject. And I grew up believing, since I was living in a British colony in the first 11 years of my life, that I was led to believe that the British people or the white people were naturally superior to the Asian people. And that whether we like it or not, our place in life was to be deferential to the Europeans or the British. And so having experienced that myself, the sense of inferiority, I know how powerful and pernicious such mental colonization can be. But at the same time, of course, being liberated from it is also a wonderful experience when you grow up to realize, hey, actually we Asians are as good as any Westerner, any European, any British. And indeed, nowadays, if you look at the performance of Asians in the leading American universities, it's clear that Asian students are now outperforming students from the West, clearly. And indeed, if, let's say, for example, the leading Ivy League universities like Harvard or Yale or Columbia or Princeton did a race-blind admission, okay? Didn't look at the race, just look at the exam results and performance. They might end up in universities where half the population is Chinese, half is Indian. And there might be no Westerners in that. So it's an amazing, in one lifetime, I have lived through a period where Asians were seen to be inferior, then Asians were seen to be equal, and now quite often they're perceived to be superior, certainly in areas like academic performance and so on and so forth.
When was that moment for you when you realized that you were on par with some of the Western peers that you had, maybe in school or when you entered foreign service?
I don't think there was a single moment, but there was a sort of a gradual process. Certainly, I would say my education in philosophy and gave me a lot of cultural confidence, because if you found that you could argue with the West on Western terms, and end up sometimes winning the arguments, then that's the first step towards, in a sense, intellectual liberation. But it was a gradual process. But certainly working with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, who were very confident, about themselves and about their ability to do things, So to some extent, I sort of inherited some of their cultural confidence just by working with them.
You worked with the three of them relatively intimately, or at least you managed to build strong relationships with them. There was Lee Kuan Yew. I think that was the man that everyone knew. Then you also had a very special relationship with Dr. Goh. And even in your formative years in foreign service, you also worked under S. Rajaratnam, where you saw him stand up in the Non-Aligned Summit. You saw him become the Singapore Lion. I would like to ask you to share a little bit more about your relationship with each of these men and how they have shaped you.
Well, I mean, I must emphasize that all three of them were my bosses. But they were the best bosses to have. They were demanding, but at the same time, they educated you a lot, So in the case of, clearly Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was the most formidable, the most intimidating person of all three of them. And so you always felt that you had to perform well when you were with him. But at the same time, while Mr. Lee Kuan Yew could be very fierce and intimidating, especially in public settings, in private settings, I described the lunches that Ambassador Tomiko, Ambassador Chan Eng-chi and I had with him regularly over a few years in the mid-1990s. When you meet him in private, he's a very good listener. He's very keen to learn about what's happening in the world. He's very curious. So in that sense, also, if you say something that is interesting or relevant, he appreciates it very much. And well, Dr. Goh was also in his own way quite intimidating, but I developed more of a personal relationship with him because I was a friend of his son, Goh Kian Chi, and his Goh Kian Chi's wife, Tan Seok San, whom you just interviewed. And so I would meet them in family settings, in their houses, and so I got to know Dr. Goh in a much more relaxed way. And he became much more relaxed after he stepped down from political office in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And certainly at lunches and dinners, he would open up to me and I described some of the things he said. And of course, Rajaratnam was the person with whom I spent the most time physically, because he was my boss in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would travel with him. When I was in KL, he would come and visit Kuala Lumpur because he had relatives in Seremban. And then I would sit in the car with him on the long car rides to Seremban and talk to him. And then when I was ambassador to the UN, he would come every year for the UN General Assembly, spend a week to 10 days in the UN, So I spent a lot of time with him. And he is by far the most relaxed, the most calm, charming person you can be with this. And he didn't believe in trying to intimidate you in the way that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew could or would,
And you spoke about him being the Singaporean lion and him standing up at the non-aligned movement back when Vietnam invaded Cambodia. You were there in person. What was the experience like? Could you share a little bit more about how you saw Mr. Rajaratnam represent Singapore, such a small state, in the global fora? How did he champion not just Singapore interests but multilateral interests in that instance?
Well, when we were in Cuba in 1979, Singapore was in some ways outgunned and outnumbered because Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, was very close to the Soviet Union, and he invited lots of leaders who were pro-Soviet Union, you know, and therefore they supported the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, because Vietnam was also tied to the Soviet Union. And so after Vietnam invaded Cambodia, the previous government should have kept its seat. The Pol Pot government, Khmer government, should have kept its seat in the non-aligned movement, but Castro wanted to get rid of them. And so he tried to organize a big meeting, and at the big meeting, many countries said, no, this cannot be done. So he organized a special small group meeting where he invited primarily leaders who were closely tied to the Soviet Union to try and intimidate Singapore and Sri Lanka, the only two non-Soviet allied states in the room. And the Sri Lankans were clearly intimidated and didn't say a word. But Mr. Rajaratnam, even though he was only a foreign minister and he had to debate heads of government, you know, presidents and prime ministers, he wasn't the least bit intimidated, not in the least bit. He stood up and fiercely defended Singapore's position. So I was really impressed by his courage, you know, because, you know, courage is always contextual. You can be very brave when there's no threat to you. But, you know, when you have to deal with, you know, people, very formidable personalities who try to intimidate you, many people would have melted in that situation. But Rajaratnam did not melt at all. So I think in that sense, I was amazed what a fierce guy he could be in a fight. And I could understand how he was such a strong, how do you say, companion of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew when he fought the communists.
The reason why I asked about that was because I think that was one of the big wars maybe in the past 60 years that maybe Southeast Asia's experienced. And now we live in a world where we're experiencing two wars. And to understand what can play out in the coming decades, it might be useful to refer back to the past. I think that was where my interest was piqued. And in your book, The ASEAN Miracle, you talk about Southeast Asia being this miracle of peace, which is why I wanted to understand, you know, how did we get here? It's like the fish in water analogy that David Foster Wallace talks about, which is that the fish that lives in water does not know that it's in water. Peace is a non-event, as you said. So when you're living in peace, you're not surprised. So I would like to maybe focus our attention on the wars that are happening now. There are two main wars now we see in the world. The first one is the war in Gaza. It's weird because we have a special relationship with Israel, but at the same time, I liken it as what's happening in Gaza is to like the millennials Vietnam War. We're being exposed to very graphic imagery across the world through social media on how the war is playing out. So then my question would be then, you know, what do you think are the obstacles to peace? Is there a way out for this?
Well, I mean, you're right. There are two ongoing wars now, the Gaza war and the Ukraine war. But, you know, I've been studying geopolitics for over 50 years now. And the big lesson I've learned is that wars are avoidable. But of course, wars are avoidable if you have wise and strong leaders who can make the right decisions to prevent wars. But quite often, and this is the tragedy about the West. In the past, it was the Western countries that had wise and strong leaders. Now, many Western countries have weak and ineffective leaders. So, for example, the Gaza war could have been avoided if, for example, the United States, which always says that it's in favor of a two-state solution, had worked harder to achieve a two-state solution. You know, so that means that Palestinians would have had a state also. Maybe a somewhat demilitarized state because Israel is very concerned about security, reasonably so. But something could have been done. But unfortunately, you haven't had any American leaders strong enough. Only the United States is big enough, strong enough to persuade the parties, Israel and Palestine, to come together. But they failed to do so. And because they failed to do so, the wound continued to fester. And then when the wound continues to fester, you get an outbreak. That's what happens. And certainly we should condemn the Hamas for its killing of innocent Israeli civilians. That's completely unjustifiable and should be condemned, But at the same time, you also have to ask yourself, could all this have been avoided if a bigger effort had maybe made to create a two-state solution? Similarly, in the Ukraine war, I also believe the Ukraine war could have been avoided. And here, surprisingly, the United States and the West had two eminent American statesmen who warned against the expansion of NATO, towards Ukraine. One was George Kennan, the man who actually was responsible for America's successful strategy in the Cold War, the containment policy. He advised strongly against NATO because he said this would alarm the Russians and trigger a negative reaction. There's a famous interview he gave to Tom Friedman, which I think everyone should read. And then also Henry Kissinger wrote an article in 2014, 10 years ago, in Washington Post suggesting a compromise formula for Ukraine, whereby, Ukraine would keep its independence and sovereignty, Ukraine could join the European Union, but Ukraine would agree not to join NATO, right? I mean, these were all sensible compromise proposals that were put forward, but unfortunately there were no strong Western leaders who were capable of carrying out this advice, And indeed, in my last conversation with Henry Kissinger one-on-one in October 2022, about a year before he died, he clearly indicated to me in a very subtle way that the quality of mind of many Western leaders today is not what it used to be. And they don't have the capacity to do strategic long-range thinking in the way that the Churchills and Eisenhowers and all could do in the past. And I think that the deterioration in the quality of Western leadership is also one of the explanations for the continuation of wars in Gaza and Ukraine.
What do you think drives that? Why is it now that there is a deterioration? What drives this? Is there like a zeitgeist that drives people to just be more short-term thinking?
Well, I think, there was a sense of intellectual complacency that enveloped the West after the end of the Cold War. And, I've said in several of my speeches that this very famous essay by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, when the essay came out, and the essay basically says that the Cold War has ended, the West has won, the West doesn't need to make any more strategic adjustments, the West can just switch on autopilot and proceed, and the rest of the world has to make strategic adjustments to this new world order. And that was an incredibly dangerous, complacent attitude that the West had developed. And as I say quite brutally in my TED Talk, which has had over 2 million views now, that Francis Fukuyama's essay did a lot of brain damage to the West because it put the West to sleep at precisely the time when Asia was waking up. And so clearly this was a time when the West has got to learn to share power with other societies, other cultures, other civilizations. This is a fairly basic thing, but it is impossible for the West to think of this, and indeed, therefore, the Western minds are making what I call metaphysical mistakes, in not understanding that the world has changed fundamentally. They've got to throw out all the ideas of Francis Fukuyama and The End of History, take them out of their brains and throw them in the rubbish can, and think of a new way of looking at the world. And the one piece of good news is that the rest of the world is preparing for the Asian century, because when I came out with my ninth book, my book of essays, The Asian 21st Century, it's a collection of essays explaining about how this will be the Asian 21st century. the publisher, a German publisher, Springer Nature, expected there to be about 20,000 downloads of this book. Instead of 20,000 downloads, there have been 3.8 million downloads of this book in over 160 countries. So the rest of the world is preparing for Asian century, but Western minds are not preparing for the Asian century, and therefore Western societies now are struggling in some ways.
Yeah, the book was free to download and I read it. I completely enjoyed it and learned a great deal from it. And one of the things that when you talk about the Asian century, you looking at the Asia or maybe even the ASEAN model as a potential model to copy. Like what Dr. Goh said, the problems have been solved by millions of other people, by other generations before us. We just need to learn how to adapt it to our situation. And when I was reading the book on the ASEAN miracle, one of the things that really screamed at me, I suppose, was you talked about the separation of Singapore and Malaysia as a lesson or an object lesson that could be used or could be learned to deal with the Israel-Palestine situation. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think whenever two countries separate, there's a lot of bitterness, and quite often the bitterness can last for generations. I mean, like for example, the bitterness between India and Pakistan. Even until today, even though they separated in 1947, right? 77 years ago. Still till today, India and Pakistan don't have normal trade relations. I mean, that's absurd. But that's a sign of how long the bitterness of separation can last. And by contrast, Malaysia and Singapore have done a remarkable job of overcoming the wounds of the past. And as I described in my book, Living the Asian Century, when I was in KL, there was still some residue in the 1970s, about a decade after the separation. There was still some residue of bitterness and acrimony towards Singapore. But I've been to KL several times this year, and it's a very different world now, where they are are willing to cooperate with Singapore in a way that is quite amazing, and it shows how Malaysia and Singapore have risen above the bitterness of the past. But this is not just Malaysia and Singapore; it's ASEAN in general. And what ASEAN has achieved is a genuine miracle, because ASEAN is by far the most diverse region of planet Earth. I mean, you can just take a quick mental tour and go to Africa, go to Latin America, go to North America, go to Europe, go to Middle East, go to Central Asia, go to the Northeast Asia. No other part of the world is as diverse as Southeast Asia is, Out of 680 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, Confucianists, and I say we also have lots of communists. So it's a very diverse region of planet Earth. This is where all the fighting should be taking place. Instead, we've had peace, for over 50 years, which is amazing, quite amazing. And that's because, as I tried to explain in the ASEAN Miracle, we were lucky to have very good, strong leaders who understood the need to cooperate. And here, a special tribute must be given to two leaders, President Suharto and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. The fact that these two men, who were culturally and intellectually so different, could get along and work together was quite an amazing feat. And that in a sense provided one of the key foundations for ASEAN.
What are the maybe institutions or the way that ASEAN has organized itself that has created this peace? Because surely this is not a miracle that was just God sent.
Like Permanent Secretary of the Foreign Ministry, the suspicion had evaporated. And a lot of this because of the Indonesian practice of consultation and consensus. So just imagine if other regions like South Asia could learn from ASEAN, you'll get much more, you get genuine peace in those areas too.
So what does this consultation and consensus look like? So if we look at the Brexit example, that was maybe, the UK left, and then now maybe they're regretting it. It's too late. In Southeast Asia, how do we implement this modus operandi that kind of avoided that British fate?
Well, I think the important thing here is that the ASEAN as an organization decided not to copy the European Union. And it's also interesting that the European Union calls itself a union, and we call ourselves an association. And associations, almost by definition, are loser arrangements. We're not united into one. We're separated. We're just cooperating. And by creating a very loose form of cooperation, which is not rigid and which is not legalistic, we are more flexible. So in the case of the European Union, you're either part of the union or you're out of the union. You cannot be halfway in, halfway out. But I think ASEAN allows you to be halfway in, halfway out. It's much looser. In fact, the way we would have handled a problem like Brexit, if we had a member that was very unhappy, and to some extent we have that situation now in Myanmar, we will basically say, you take a vacation, go for a vacation for 5-10 years, and then you decide whether you want to come back and participate fully in ASEAN or not. So, that if the European Union could have given the UK a vacation, they would have solved the problem that they have. But of course, the Europeans are so rigid and so legalistic that they cannot accommodate any flexibility. And right now, the European Union is also being very rigid and legalistic in its approach to the Ukraine war also, instead of trying to figure out compromises that would try to solve the problem. But this is again a result of partly because the European Union, which has become a geopolitically incompetent organization, partly because it's very rigid and legalistic, and partly also because, as Henry Kissinger hinted to me, the quality of mind of European leaders is not what it used to be. And therefore, I predict that the European Union is going to have a very hard time in the 21st century because it hasn't learned the art of being flexible like ASEAN and adjusting and adapting to a new, different world.
Yeah. I like the idea that you talked about, which is that in Southeast Asia, we had Indonesia who exported this idea of consultation and consensus. And therefore, I think in that statement alone, you imply that there is a form of trade of ideas in Southeast Asia as well, not just in goods and services, but in the way we think about things. And one of your recommendations is that Singapore should be the intellectual capital of Southeast Asia, or at least ASEAN. What would that actually look like practically?
Well, I think for a start, Singapore is blessed that we have succeeded in our economic development. So we now have the resources to invest in intellectual institutions. And by the way, it's quite remarkable that Singapore, it's a country of less than 5 million people. Actually, the citizens are only 3.2 million, by the way. Can have 2 world-class universities, NUS and NTU. That's quite amazing, quite amazing. And there's no others in Southeast Asia, right? So since we have the resources to create world-class universities, world-class think tanks, we have the opportunity to do a lot of research on Southeast Asia, its history, its background, what's going on. And we are speaking today on 25th October. Just yesterday on 24th October, as chairman of the jury panel for the NUS Singapore History Prize, we announced the winner of the NUS Singapore History Prize. And the book is ostensibly the food of the Singapore Malays, but it's actually a very profound historical work that brings out how rich the connections were in the Malay archipelago long before the British or the Westerners came to Southeast Asia. And indeed, 100 years ago already, Singapore was what the author calls the New York of the Nusantara, you know. So, there are all these rich historical connections in Southeast Asia that were in some ways washed away by the colonial period. But now that the colonial period is gone, we can go back and dive into what Southeast Asia was like before the colonial period. And the one country that has the greatest amount of resources to do this seriously is Singapore. Which is why, by the way, Dr. Goh Keng Swee wisely anticipated this need. And he was the one who proposed the idea of an Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. That's an example of the kind of long-range thinking that Dr. Goh Keng Swee used to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting because now you see when people want to understand Southeast Asia, the first place they go to is the publications of the Institute of Southeast Asia Studies. With that said, I think there is a part on ASEAN which I think we can't ignore, which is what we see in Myanmar now. I think that's the part that I think agonizes a lot of people as well. It may have not received as much attention recently because of the two wars that we see unfold in other parts of the world. But if we were to understand Myanmar, how should us Southeast Asians or the rest of ASEAN understand and approach this problem that we see?
Well, I think, one lesson I learned in my life after having, now I'm 76 years old, is that in life there are actually impossible problems. And you mustn't try and kill yourself trying to solve impossible problems, because some problems just need a lot of time. And Myanmar will need some time. And clearly the military establishment that was created by General Ne Win, who ruled, as you know, Myanmar for a long time, has developed a solid grasp of power in Myanmar. And it actually believes that if the Myanmar military is not strong, the country will break apart. So they're determined to maintain strong military rule. And there was a moment, there was an opportunity for peace, when Aung San Suu Kyi came back and became the leader. But sadly, Aung San Suu Kyi, whom I admire, who's a very strong person, by the way, also was unfortunately sometimes quite rigid and unwilling to compromise with the Myanmar military. Whereas if she had been more flexible and had compromised with the Myanmar military, you could have had a compromise solution for Myanmar. So I think at the end of the day, the worst thing we can do is to stop talking to the Myanmar military. I think the ASEAN leaders should continue to talk to them, and frankly continue to invite them to visit the rest of Southeast Asia, because the only way to tell the Myanmar military that Myanmar is falling behind the rest of Southeast Asia is by asking them to come and visit Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Jakarta, and then they will see, wow, we are falling behind, and we have to do something to catch up with that. So we have to be patient with Myanmar, and I think after 10 to 20 years, we might find things will gradually turn around and improve again.
And that was what we saw actually when Deng Xiaoping visited Southeast Asia after he took power in China. And you also detailed about that change in that relationship from being condemned as a neo-colonialist plot to something that was much more friendly and conciliatory in that within a decade. So it is possible for peace.
Yeah, I mean, Deng Xiaoping, as you know, inherited a China that had gone through some wrenching challenges, especially during the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. And Chinese people suffered a lot as a result of those things. But in my view, Deng Xiaoping will go down in history as the greatest leader of the 20th century, because he actually lifted more people out of poverty than any human leader has in human history. And at the same time, he inherited a system and an organization that was dysfunctional at that time. The Chinese Communist Party had been taken over by an extreme faction. And somehow or other, he managed to engineer a revolution and then put China on a growth path, making it the fastest growing large economy in the world, you know. Quite amazing what Deng Xiaoping did. And we actually in Southeast Asia have benefited from Deng Xiaoping's U-turn, because before he came into office, the Chinese communists were still saying that they supported the communist parties in Southeast Asia, supported revolution in Southeast Asia. But Deng Xiaoping turned that round after Mr. Lee Kuan Yew spoke to him and explained to him, how can we in Southeast Asia become your friends if you're calling on the communist parties to overthrow the governments in Southeast Asia? So that shows you the importance of conversations. The conversation that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had with Deng Xiaoping helped to change Chinese policy. In the same way, we should invite the Myanmar leaders to come to visit the rest of Southeast Asia and have conversations with Southeast Asian leaders. And then they will realize, hey, we should consider a change of approach.
Yeah. The common thread throughout this conversation and your thinking has always been, I think, two characteristics of leaders. Is the strategic long-range thinking and also the suppleness. There's a suppleness that you need in the way that you think and approach problems. And as you are an elder statesman now, and you wrote in Has China Won 2 letters to the 2 different leaders of the US and China. And if I were to ask you today to write a 3rd letter to the leader of Singapore, it could be our current Prime Minister, it could be a 5G or 6G leader, what would you say to that Prime Minister?
Well, I would say that, number one, I try not to get involved in advising the government, you know. But at the same time, I also keep saying, this is publicly, that Singapore faces a great opportunity in the 21st century. Because you know why? If the 21st century is going to be the Asian century, and I believe it will be the Asian century, you've got to find a natural capital for it, okay? Now, in the 19th century was the European century. The Europeans ran the world. And the natural capital for it was London. London was the most successful city in the European century. And then the 20th century was the American century. And clearly, the capital for the American century was New York. This is an incredibly dynamic, vibrant city in which I've lived in for over a decade, and consider it my 2nd favorite city after Singapore. And the 21st century also needs a capital, and the best candidate for it clearly is Singapore, because Singapore is the only city in Asia where all the 3 major Asian civilizational streams, like the Chinese civilizational stream, the Indian civilizational stream, the Islamic civilizational stream come together. And the Western civilizational stream is also alive and well in Singapore. So Singapore can be the natural capital of the Asian century. But that requires some degree of boldness and vision on the part of some of the younger Singaporeans who have to articulate. This mission has to be undertaken by younger Singaporeans of your age who've got to see that this is where the future is.
That's great. I think that's something I'll think about deeply as well, about how we can be champions of the fusion of civilizations, as you say, right? That we need to be able to bring the best out of each civilization and express it in its purest or most beautiful form in Singapore. On that note, I think I would like to ask you a final question, which would be, now that you're 76, you have lived a full life in Singapore, you've contributed greatly to our country as not just a diplomat, not just as a public servant, but also as a public intellectual. They've exported a ton of intellectual capital to the world. And now I wanted to ask you for your advice for the younger Singaporeans. So if you were to give us advice to those who want to make our mark in this world, or who want to contribute to the growth and the flourishing of Singapore, what would you say?
Well, I would say that, for me, if I look back now, in my book, Living the Asian Century, I came from a very poor family, very poor background. I should never have gone to university, and I should have been a textile salesman. That would have been my natural destiny. But somehow or other, I ended up in university and succeeding in life, And if there's one factor that turned my life significantly, it was my discovery of the Juchat Public Library at a very young age, at 6 or maybe 8 or 10 years old. I discovered the library, and with my friend Jeffrey Sung, we used to go there regularly and borrow several books a week and read several books a week as a young person. So I would say that young Singaporeans need to read more books. I mean, nowadays, as you know, most young people spend their time on social media, and very few of them actually pick up a book and read it cover to cover. But I must say, but the young ones who read my Living the Asian Century actually feel that they learn something new from it. So since the 21st century, it's going to be very different from the 19th and 20th centuries. You're going to see an Asian Renaissance take place. You have to understand Asian history better if you're going to understand the Asian Renaissance. So read more books on Asian history. Southeast Asia's history, read the book that just won the Singapore History Prize. Read the 2 books that were the runners-up for the Singapore History Prize. And then you will begin to understand both Singapore and Southeast Asia better.
Yeah. With that, I'd like to say that we hope that next year maybe we'll win the Nobel Peace Prize as ASEAN. Mm-hmm. We haven't won it yet. It's 2024 now, but maybe in 2025 that will be the year. And thank you, Prof, for coming on.
Yeah, but for us to win the Nobel Peace Prize, it's very important for the Norwegians who run the Nobel Peace Prize to understand the world better. Sadly, they don't understand Southeast Asia, but hopefully they'll come and visit Southeast Asia and see. Just imagine if you can have a Southeast Asia without a Ukraine war, without a Gaza war. This is the region that deserves a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, and maybe in 2025 that will be the year. Maybe when we invite them and let them have some nasi lemak and chili crab, that will be the year that we'll win the Peace Prize. Yeah. Thank you so much, Prof, for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I bought a copy of the memoirs, Living the Asian Century by Prof. Kishore. It's autographed. So if you'd like a copy, what I'll recommend is you subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to my newsletter. And I'll be choosing one lucky winner in a week's time. And you will be notified as to who is the winner in the newsletter. So I'd like to thank you. And once again, if you haven't read the book yet, I recommend you go read it. It's really full of gems and insights that I think you'll appreciate and enjoy.